Am I on this one? Yeah. Thank you for having me. My name is Claus Verner, and I have been 5 years in Amazon. And all of those 5 years, all I've been doing is meeting with startups all over the world and helping them scale out of their city, helping them scale out of their country, out of Europe, and basically go global with their business, with their application through the Amazon Web Services, the cloud, right? I'm here at Startup Istanbul with the local Turkish team. I don't know where they're sitting, if Müge is here. Here, if you can stand up quickly. If you want to speak to someone from Amazon, just grab one of those, or me. We will be here the whole event. We'll be here on Monday. And with that out of the way, I will go into the presentation. Okay? So, how many here is familiar with the Dunbar number? Not a lot. So the Dunbar number is a number set, and it's supposed to express how many people you can actually comprehend around you, right? And there's different numbers going around, 100, 150 people. And I'm here today to talk about how to scale past that number in your company and then still keep that startup DNA that made you excited in the first place, that created your first products, that created the innovation, that got you to that number, right? But before that, let me see here. I press that one, maybe? Yeah. Before that, I'm gonna briefly touch upon why cloud is important in this context. So how many read the Lean Startup? It's a Bible, right, for startups, right? And the author said cloud is like a fertilizer that creates startups. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about that, right? So usually what we see is that startups will know the problem they're solving, but they won't know, who their customer will be. Sometimes they don't even know which problem they're solving with their startups, and this is a cycle that goes around, and you're trying to validate different parts of your business, getting to that right moment where your startup starts to scale. So according to the Lean Startup methodology, startups, they learn and they adapt, right? Because it's ever changing, the situation for the startups the whole time. Can I ask, where should I point this? Because it's not really responding. Is it here? Is it there? Okay. So usually this is the process that a startup goes through. So you focus on a simple implementation of an idea. You start with a minimum set of core values. You release it, right? And you basically take your MVP, give it out to your users, and get feedback, right? And an MVP, I believe, is often misunderstood. Like a lot of startups take the MVP as almost like a finished product that can go on the App Store in iTunes, for example. Where I see the MVP as a much, much smaller thing, especially the initial one. In Amazon, we had MVPs launched where the whole service or product ended up with a buy button. And whoever clicked that buy button would just get to an email list sign up. That was it. So no code was written, no product was created, but we just described the service and saw if people were willing to click the buy button, right? So that could be an MVP. And you can make an MVP like that for dollars, right? So you go on Fiverr, you create a product video for $5. You do a landing page on Wix, and you set up a Google AdWords campaign. And then you see if people Google the problem or the service, get to your landing page, and actually are willing to click the buy button. And all you do is say, dear Mr. Customer, we haven't launched yet, sign up for the launch, right? So it doesn't have to be an MVP with angel money behind it, with hours of work. Just test your idea and get it out there for a couple of bucks, right? So this is a very simplified kind of life cycle of the startup's first time, right? So on one axis you have the scale, the size of users, customers, right? And on the other axis you have time. And then basically the innovation and the iteration to get to an MVP, which is the yellow line, it goes up and down, you try, you go back to scratch, you try again, and every time you hit the yellow line, it's when you actually have an MVP to release, but it fails, you go back again to the drawing board, back and forward, and then hopefully we get the hockey stick growth that everybody wants in the end, where you scale past your MVP and start to acquire users a lot, right? So, one example here, and this is a quiz. This is a startup that we all know and we probably all have in our phones. It was originally called Odeo, and it was a site to share and create podcasts. Does anyone know what startup came out of that startup after a lot of iterations? So it was Twitter, right? Twitter started as a podcast creating and sharing site, and now it's a huge microblogging, right? After a lot of iterations, they ended up with that. Another one, I'm from Denmark, so this company is from Finland. That's the only hint I'll give you. They developed 51 games, all of them small, big failures. And then game number 52, does anyone know what that game was? Angry Birds, yes. So 51 games, almost all of them launched on the App Store, and then 52, they hit the jackpot, right? A lot of iterations. So let's try to do a scenario here. Like this is what we are seeing with our startup customers in Amazon Web Services. So a small team, could be here in Istanbul, an idea for a mobile app, 3 months to get to launch, unknown customer, unknown problem they're solving, unknown solution, and no money at all, right? So what you would do at Amazon Web Services, you would set up a simple architecture for the dev test environment to start building this idea, right? So you would have our DNS server, Route 53, a load balancer, a single server, a single database, and you would start testing and start getting to the first phase, right? This you can start up for free. It's like we have a free tier usage. It would cost you, any startup here, it would cost you $0 to start that up. Then you do the alpha release, right? Again, we move further in the innovation cycle here. The only thing we're going to change is we're going to add an extra server, so we have a failover mechanism. We don't want our alpha users to have a bad experience. If one server fails, they can go to the other. But not that much changed in the architecture. You can run this $10-15 per month. Again, depending on the size of what you use, but this is just an example, right? Then we go to beta release. And this is where I would say now we hit the MVP, right? Now we are adding what we call auto-scaling to the server layer. So if you have more users than expected, maybe you get mentioned on Product Hunt as you saw before in the presentation, or in the media, and suddenly you get 100, 1,000, 10,000 users in one day. So we add what we call auto-scaling, and the auto-scaling layer, basically based on metrics that you set, for example, the CPU utilization of the server, will scale up, add one more server if the load increases, right? And we will also add a read-write replica on the database layer. Now we're at $235 per month. Again, to have this mechanism in place, of course, if you scale to, I don't know, 100 servers per day, this price will go up, but at least you are set up for the success you might have if your MVP takes off, right? The good thing about this is, you can get from idea to MVP for around $250, and you can basically repeat this cycle again and again and again, right? And it won't cost you that much. And that's the beauty of cloud, right? You can just take everything you build. If it doesn't work, if you want to go another direction, just kill it with one click of a button and start over, right? You won't have a lot of expensive hardware or contracts on your back that will hold you down going forward with your startup. Okay, so let me move into speaking about culture and innovation in the startup and as the startup scales, right? So some people in here might be familiar with the customer discovery process, right? It's where you have your idea, you have your MVP, and now you want to find out who your customer will be for this product or service, right? And then you go out and you try to validate it, the customer. Find out, is he really interested in this? Would he be willing to pay for it, right? If you cannot validate the customer, you pivot, you go back, and you try again, and you keep repeating, right? And most startups will spend basically all their times in those two first phases, right? Trying to get that right. And a lot of startups spends no time of the company building. So what do I mean when I say company building? It's the culture, right? It's the culture that the founders of the startup brought in from ground zero, and the culture you have in the office, the ethics you work by, the principles you work by in that startup, no matter if you're 2 people or 10 people, that's the company building, right? Defining that, making sure that you keep it. So a lot of in here watches a show that I watch every day, not every day, when it's on. It's the Silicon Valley show from HBO, right? I know there's a lot of fans in the startup ecosystem of this show because we can laugh of ourselves, right? And a lot of the things in this show is actually scaring realistically, right? Because the reality is a lot of startups, when they start to scale, they end up in a Shakespearean tragedy, right? So it can be founders not being matched correctly and going at each other. It can be the first investor, the angel investor, or the VC you get on board that doesn't get the vision and the culture of the original founders. And it can also be the first employees you take on that was simply the wrong employees and didn't fit the culture. And now you have to, within first year of your startup, fire someone, right? So if you don't define that culture from the beginning, there's a high chance you will end up in a Shakespearean tragedy for your startup with a lot of drama, right? And people stabbing each other. But despite that, we have examples of companies that started out in a garage that actually managed to keep that culture that made them so successful in that garage, all the way up to being Fortune 500 companies or very successful startups. So we have, some examples like Brian Chesky from Airbnb. I'm gonna go more into detail on him. Dropbox, Microsoft, Bill Gates. He built such a strong culture in Microsoft that he managed to leave his own company, put in place another CEO, and still have that CEO drive that Microsoft culture ahead to the future, right? And then our own dear leader from Amazon, Mr. Jeff Bezos. I'm also going to talk more about him later, okay? But again, these guys proved you can scale out of that garage and keep the culture that got you there in the first place. So Airbnb, everyone here knows Airbnb. It's the sharing economy, one of the first good examples of sharing economy, right? That got to scale. You put your apartment on Airbnb, you rent apartments on Airbnb. It's about sharing, it's about community, it's about getting the tips from your host to where is the good Turkish coffee in your neighborhood in Levant. It's an open community, and you open your home. One of the most intimate things you can have in your life, you open it up to strangers, right? So that's kind of the feeling of the product, and that's also the culture that Airbnb was founded on. I don't know if you heard the story, but like the first thing they ever rented out was an air mattress on the floor in their apartment in San Francisco, right? So they did this. That was the foundation of the company. So how is Brian, so we're going to talk a little bit about how that culture infiltrates in Airbnb as a company. So around 2013, Airbnb saw that hockey stick growth, right? It really took off. And they went from 4 million to 9 million guests, yearly guests, right? And we saw the same thing because Airbnb is running all their infrastructure on Amazon. So the number of servers went from 24, 48, 432 servers, 1,000 servers in the same period, right? The photos of the apartments in S3, our storage service, went from gigabytes to terabytes to 50 terabytes from 284 gigabytes. So we saw the same hockey stick growth on our side, right, when we look at the dashboards. And around this moment, Brian Chesky, he sat down with one of their first investors, Peter Thiel, and he asked, what's the single most important piece of advice you have for us when we go through this hockey stick growth? Because Peter Thiel had tried it before, and he had seen a lot of companies do this, so Brian wanted to get his opinion, right? And he actually, Peter Thiel came back with this, and this is the R-rated version, don't mess up the culture. He actually used another word, but I won't put it on this slide, right? And that inspired Brian Chesky to sit down and write about this culture building, this company building experience in a blog post. I have the link up here, but you can find it if you just Google that with the other word in it, right? So Brian Chesky said, the culture is what creates the foundation of all future innovation. If you break the culture, you break the machine that creates your products, right? So that first product they got out of Airbnb, that came from the culture. If he had broken the culture, they wouldn't have kept launching new services and products on Airbnb and features and all of this, right? That machine would have been broken. So how do they do it? How do you keep that startup DNA as you scale, and how do you build it into your company, right? So the biggest challenge for a lot of startups is to get that first investment, right? So they will put a lot of focus on the investor pitch deck, right? Then secondly, I would say they look at the customer pitch deck, securing the first customers, getting those big customers on board, right? And they totally forget about the employee pitch deck. Getting employee number, let's say 2, 3, 4, 5, up to 10. What does the employee look like that we want? What can we offer from our culture, right? You're competing with us, for example, in Amazon. We're probably going for some of the same guys you're going for, right? So how can you offer something that we can't? Open office spaces, cool workplaces, complete like ping pong tables in the office. All of this, like, it's very simple what I'm saying, but you need to find out what makes you unique as a workplace, basically, right? And then make sure that you find the right people that match that culture. So let's look at who should share the culture. So the founders we already covered. They are the ones bringing the culture into the company and defining it, right? And then the first employees. Brian Chesky sat in on the first 500 interviews of the first 500 employees that got hired, making sure there was a cultural fit, right? And then those employees sit in on the next employees getting hired, making sure there's a cultural fit, right? So don't outsource your hiring. Don't leave it up to a recruitment company. Make sure there's a cultural fit, right? The organization in Airbnb, everything is very open. On the tech side, they use open source. They participate in tech meetups in the communities they're in. So they share the technology and the people that works for them. They organize themselves in no more than 10 people per team, and they do cross-cultural, cross-department teams. So they will put a data scientist in a customer service team, right? Again, back to the idea of Airbnb, the community, the sharing, right? They try to put it in the organization also. So the next two sections that should share your culture is the investors. The investors we already touched upon. If they are not on board with what you want to do and how you want to do it, it's going to go wrong down the road. And they're going to, like in Silicon Valley, throw out the CEO and put one in who they feel is the right one for the company, right? So get your investors on board with your culture. And the last thing is you can even extend your culture to your customer and partners. So again, back to Airbnb. If I'm a good host on Airbnb and I get 5-star ratings because I take good care of my guests and I follow the culture of Airbnb and I don't use it just as an apartment rental service, booking service, right? They will reward me with the superhost status. And with that status, I will be prioritized in the search rankings. So my apartment will go number 1, right? When someone searched on Istanbul. The same way when I'm the guest, the host will rate me and see if I follow the culture of Airbnb. Do I trash the place? Am I a nice person, right? And then with a 5-star rating on me, I can get access to the most beautiful apartments in Istanbul because the host, they trust me. So Airbnb managed to extend their culture all the way down to the partners, the host, and the customers, me, right? Okay, so when you're at scale, this is where we are from, right? Amazon Web Services, Amazon.com, right? Every day we are held to the Amazon leadership principles, right? And some of you works in corporations, some of you have worked for corporates that have similar leadership principles or values somewhere on the web page or on a name tag or something. But you're never really held against them. I tried that in some of my previous companies. Every day I'm held to these leadership principles inside Amazon. I'm in business development. I have targets, I have goals. I can miss those goals and still be a valued employee if I follow those leadership principles. But I can also, on the other hand, hit those goals and knock them out of the park and then get thrown out of Amazon if I don't follow those leadership principles. So those are the most important things in Amazon. And I'm going to dive into a couple of them. Okay, ownership. I'm going to give you the official definition, right? Leaders are owners. They think long-term and don't sacrifice long-term value for short-term results. They act on behalf of the entire company, not just beyond their own team. And they never say, no, that's not my job. I give you an example of this. So in Amazon, we were working with DevOps even before we called it DevOps, right? So the principle where you take your development team and you also give them responsibility and ownership of the actual operations of the code they're writing, right, and the application. We organized them into 2 pizza teams, American pizzas, right? So again, around 10 people. And if the team grows larger than this, we split it up and we make 2 competing teams, basically. If we keep doing this, we will make sure that the team you work in can take fast decisions, move fast, and have that, I'm not saying we're a startup, but have that startup feeling where you feel like a close team of 10 people building something, working towards the same goal without a big bureaucracy or management interfering with our daily job, right? So a lot of ownership and a lot of responsibility by doing this, right? No micromanagement. If you're a micromanaging startup, I don't know if they exist, then this is not the way to go for you. Dive deep, okay? Another leadership principle. Leaders operate at all levels, stay connected to the details, and audit frequently. No task is beneath them. This comes through in what we call the weekly ops metrics meetings. So every business owner or business leader in Amazon, he will attend one of these weekly ops meetings. And in that meeting, the metrics that have impact on customers will be reviewed and audited, right? So everything that can impact the customer, that's the metric we are holding the managers up to, right? So if we start to see that metric deviate, we set in place a correction of error process to try to get the metric back again, right, to where it should be. An example of this was when we first launched Amazon Video, it was a video rental service, like digital video. It was not a all-you-can-eat kind of Netflix model. And when we launched it, there was a bug in the video player. So when some customers pressed play, the video wouldn't start. So they would have to kind of rewind, press play, and then the video would start. This was caught in a weekly ops metrics meeting, and we basically proactively refunded every customer that had this problem, and we fixed the bug, right? So we wanted to make sure that whatever metric that had impact for customers would be rolled back as soon as we found it, right? Customer obsession, that's the one I believe we are most famous for, right? So leaders start with the customer and work backwards. They work vigorously to earn and keep the customer's trust. Although leaders pay attention to competitors, they obsess over customers. And this comes back to the way we innovate and the MVP we talked about in the beginning. Because in Amazon, when you want to do a new feature, a new service, a new product, you start by writing the press release. And you do that before you even write one line of code, right? and you write that press release in a way that it's good enough to send to the New York Times, right? Then you take that press release and you send it to a circle of trusted people you have. Investors, employees, co-founders, family, friends, right? And you sit and you wait for their reaction. Are there questions coming back, right? How much will it cost? Will we be able to use it in Turkey? Does it come in blue, right? All these questions, when they come back, you take those and you build your FAQ to the product, right? So now you almost have a landing page of that product with an FAQ for the product. If no questions are coming back on that press release, if no excitement is stirred up from that press release, you're probably not, you should probably stop while you're ahead, right? And iterate on that press release and redefine the product you want. If there's no excitement, no questions, no one cares. And why should your future customers then, right? So after that, you find, after you've written the FAQ and hopefully you got a lot of questions, you move on to finding a primitive. Could be an MVP, it's very similar to that. But to give you an example, for those who are very into Amazon Web Services, so the primitive for Amazon Web Services, which now is a global cloud platform in almost all over the world with almost, you know, I think we're close to 80, 100 services now, and a lot of features, right? It started with the API for our storage service S3. That was the primitive. And we took that API and we gave it to some customers. They were all startups, by the way, our first customers on Amazon Web Services. And they started using it. And we got feedback. We launched it. We iterated. We got feedback. That's point number 4. And that's how we built up the Amazon Web Services platform from scratch. It all started with a press release written by Andy Jassy, our CEO, right? Internally in Amazon as internal innovation. So, summing up a little bit here, some of the innovation methodologies in Amazon that we use to keep innovating even as a Fortune 500 company, right? We work backwards from the customer, right? Many people said it on stage today. Start with the customer. Don't start writing code, right? We have something called the narrative process, right? So actually, PowerPoints are kind of illegal in Amazon, so we write narratives. It could be a 1-pager, 2-pager, 6-pager, describing your idea, describing what you want to communicate, where you put the data, the facts, everything in, and then you distribute that narrative through people you want to work with. You read it, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and then you start discussing on the things that matters, instead of standing here listening to me for half an hour, right? I could have actually given you a narrative. The primitives, we talked about that, another word for MVPs. Single-threaded teams, 2 pizza teams, keep it small, keep the organization agile so it can move fast, take decisions fast. Release fast, you know, deliver results, measure and iterate, okay? So the startup DNA should be a mix of the culture you're building, the mechanisms you're setting in place to keep that culture intact, the organization you're building that should have a red thread to the culture, and the architecture. That's how it should end up with keeping that startup DNA. So thank you. Any questions, you just grab me or anyone from Amazon who's here today. We'll be here the whole weekend, and thank you for having me.